In the pale light of early morning, the Atlantic shoreline of Long Island looks deceptively serene. Waves slide in and retreat with rhythmic precision, their foamy edges catching the sun's reflection like fragments of shattered glass. Behind the dunes, tall reeds sway in the ocean breeze, masking the stillness of a place that would later become a name whispered in fear, Gilgo Beach. The stretch of sand, remote yet within reach of suburban sprawl, would slowly unravel into one of the most disturbing serial murder cases in modern American history. It began, as such cases often do, not with the discovery of a carefully orchestrated crime scene, but with a missing person. In May 2010, a 24-year-old woman named Shannon Gilbert vanished in the labyrinthine marshes behind Oak Beach, a private, secluded community not far from Gilgo. She had been last seen running through the night, barefoot and disoriented, pounding on doors, and eventually disappearing into the darkness. Her frantic disappearance would ignite a search, not only for her, but for something far darker than anyone imagined. In December of that same year, a Suffolk County police officer was conducting a training exercise with his K-9 partner along the Ocean Parkway, a narrow strip of road running between the beach and the marsh. The dog alerted to something hidden beneath the brambles and underbrush. What the officer uncovered was not Shannon Gilbert, but the skeletal remains of another young woman wrapped in burlap. Her identity would later be confirmed as Melissa Barthelemy, a 24-year-old from the Bronx. This single, grim find was enough to turn the area into a crime scene, but the days that followed would reveal the depth of the horror. Within a week, 3 more sets of remains were located along the same stretch of road. Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Megan Waterman, and Amber Lynn Costello, all young women, all with strikingly similar backgrounds, were found, each bound by a chilling pattern. Like Melissa, each had been a sex worker. All had vanished in recent years. All were disposed of with an unsettling level of consistency. The uniformity of the crimes left little doubt. Someone had been hunting along Long Island's southern fringe for years, depositing bodies where few would stumble across them. The investigation shifted immediately into the realm of serial homicide. Forensic teams combed through the sandy soil, collecting fragments of bone and fabric, mapping each find with painstaking precision. The landscape itself became a puzzle. The road was long, bordered by dense thickets on one side and marshland on the other, and the killer had clearly chosen the location for its isolation. Winter winds swept the scene, carrying the faint scent of decay from places investigators had not yet reached. It became clear that this was not a singular act of violence, but a graveyard in plain sight. Public reaction was swift and electric. Local residents, accustomed to thinking of their neighborhoods as safe and removed from the kind of violence seen in urban centers, now found themselves living in proximity to an active hunting ground. The ocean, once a source of peace and leisure, became an ominous backdrop to the knowledge that somewhere nearby, a predator had been operating undetected. Media outlets descended on the area, helicopters tracing slow arcs above the dunes, their cameras capturing the stark white crime scene tense against the winter-brown landscape. Authorities faced mounting pressure. Suffolk County Police, alongside the New York State Police, the FBI, and local law enforcement agencies, began piecing together timelines. The work was complicated by the victims' lifestyles. Many of them had been transient, moving between short-term rentals and relying on cell phones for communication. The killer appeared to know this world well. Phone records showed that Melissa Barthelemy's phone had been used to make taunting calls to her younger sister after her disappearance. The calls were traced to locations in Manhattan, near the crowded streets of Midtown, suggesting a killer who could navigate both the isolation of Long Island's beaches and the anonymity of the city. The question of whether Shannon Gilbert's disappearance was connected to the other victims lingered in the background. At first, investigators treated her case as separate, citing the chaotic circumstances of her final hours. Yet the geographic proximity, coupled with the sudden discovery of multiple victims in the same area, made it impossible not to wonder if she, too, had crossed paths with the same person responsible for the burlap-wrapped bodies. By the time winter deepened into the new year, the Gilgo Beach murders had shifted from a local tragedy into a case with national attention. The setting, a picturesque coastal community, clashed violently with the nature of the crimes. The killer's careful disposal method suggested both familiarity with the area and a level of planning that frustrated investigators. It was as if the perpetrator had mapped out the environment years in advance, knowing where the ground cover would conceal his work, where the sound of the ocean would mask any noise, and where the remoteness would delay discovery. Yet, even with the growing task force, progress was painfully slow. DNA analysis moved at the pace of the technology available, and the sheer physical search of the Parkway corridor took months. With each passing week, more bones were unearthed, expanding the known list of victims beyond the original 4. The story that had begun with a missing woman was now a sprawling mystery of at least 10 sets of remains, some dating back over a decade. And among them, the disappearance of Shannon Gilbert still hovered like a phantom clue, the first tremor that had exposed a hidden catastrophe. The marshes and dunes of Gilgo Beach had kept their secret for years. Now, under the relentless attention of law enforcement and media, they began to yield it in fragments, each one colder and more disturbing than the last. The search for more victims intensified as winter yielded reluctantly to spring. Law enforcement expanded their sweep east and west along Ocean Parkway, probing every overgrown patch of ground, every inlet, and every narrow path that led from the roadside into the brush. What began as a targeted effort to locate one missing woman had turned into the systematic excavation of a clandestine dumping ground. By April 2011, the number of victims linked to the site had grown. Skeletal remains, some incomplete, surfaced in stages. Investigators identified not only additional women but also a toddler and an unidentified man, a development that complicated earlier theories about the killer's victim profile. While the majority of the known victims shared similarities in age, occupation, and physical characteristics, these new discoveries hinted at a broader, possibly more chaotic pattern of violence. The marshland yielded clues grudgingly, as if reluctant to give up the secrets it had harbored for years. The skeletal remains were often scattered, bleached by sun and weather, and wrapped in varying materials. For some, burlap was still present, its fibers clinging to bones like a grim signature. Others had been placed without wrapping, exposed to the elements. The variation suggested either multiple offenders or an evolution in the killer's methods over time. Forensic anthropologists worked alongside detectives, reconstructing what they could from the fragments, establishing timelines of death that spanned more than a decade. It became apparent that Gilgo Beach was not a single burial site but part of a larger network of disposal locations. Links emerged between remains found there and earlier discoveries on Fire Island and in Nassau County. Some victims had been dismembered, their parts scattered in different jurisdictions, complicating investigative efforts. This fragmentation, both of bodies and of the investigative landscape, created jurisdictional challenges. Multiple police departments, the New York State Police, and the FBI all held pieces of the puzzle, but the edges didn't align neatly. In the background, the public's fascination and fear grew in equal measure. Media outlets revisited every known detail, airing maps of the crime scenes, timelines of disappearances, and speculative profiles of the killer. Theories proliferated. Some saw the killer as a meticulous planner, possibly with law enforcement or military training, given the choice of remote yet accessible sites and the apparent knowledge of investigative blind spots. Others speculated about a local resident who blended seamlessly into the surrounding communities, moving without drawing suspicion. The geography of the case became an unspoken character in the narrative. Long Island's South Shore, with its long barrier beaches, salt marshes, and thin strips of highway, offered both concealment and quick escape routes. Ocean Parkway, the ribbon of asphalt connecting Jones Beach to Captree State Park, ran parallel to an environment that was at once open and claustrophobic. On one side, the Atlantic stretched to the horizon, on the other, dense thickets of beach grass and scrub pine obscured the ground. The wind carried the constant hiss of waves, masking other sounds and making the isolation almost absolute after dark. Detectives pieced together victim timelines by working backward. Many had last been seen after arranging to meet a client. Several used disposable cell phones, known as burners, for their work. The killer had exploited these habits, contacting them anonymously and leaving little traceable data. Phone records that did exist painted a disturbing picture. After Melissa Barthelomew's disappearance, her phone had been used repeatedly to taunt her younger sister from crowded areas in Manhattan. The calls were short, the voice calm but cruel, the movements careful enough to avoid detection by nearby surveillance cameras. The task force assembled to investigate the murders developed a working profile. The suspect was likely a male in his 30s to 50s, familiar with the sex work industry and the geography of Long Island's coastal roads. He would have been methodical, with the ability to control his impulses enough to avoid detection for years. The disposal site suggested confidence. The bodies were placed where they would not be found quickly, yet not so far into the wilderness as to require extensive transport on foot. The burlap wrappings, in particular, drew attention. This material was less common in modern packaging, hinting at someone with access to agricultural, industrial, or hunting supplies. Even as the profile took shape, the case remained stagnant in crucial ways. Physical evidence linking the crimes to a single individual was minimal. DNA recovered from the remains was degraded by time and exposure. Witnesses were scarce. The very isolation that had allowed the killer to operate also meant there were few, if any, accidental observers. The beach communities themselves were tight-knit, with seasonal residents who came and went, and full-time residents who valued privacy. It was an environment in which someone could live quietly for years, their activities unnoticed, their secrets intact. In late 2011, searchers discovered human remains in the marsh near where Shannon Gilbert had last been seen. Her disappearance had been the catalyst for the entire investigation, yet her case remained controversial. The official position, based on the evidence available, was that she had likely become disoriented in the marsh and drowned. The medical examiner found no definitive signs of homicide. Still, her family and many in the public believed she had been murdered and that her death was tied to the Gilgo Beach killer. The timing, geography, and circumstances were too much to dismiss as coincidence. By the close of that year, the known victim count linked to the Gilgo Beach area and its connected sites stood at 10, possibly 11. Behind each name was a life cut short, a family left with unanswered questions, and a community unsettled by the realization that the killer might still be among them. Despite the extensive manpower and resources dedicated to the case, the perpetrator remained unidentified, his shadow stretching over the barrier beaches and the minds of those who lived in their vicinity. The task force's work was far from over. Leads would surface and fade, suspects would be questioned and released, and the case would remain one of the most chilling and complex in New York's criminal history. The ocean continued to roll against the shore, indifferent to the human tragedies scattered along its edge. The years that followed the initial discoveries at Gilgo Beach were marked by long stretches of stagnation. The task force remained active, but the absence of definitive forensic breakthroughs meant that leads often dissolved before they could be fully developed. Public interest, once intense and unrelenting, began to ebb, though the case never fully left the headlines. For the families of the victims, time brought no resolution, only a deepening frustration with the lack of progress. Speculation filled the void left by the absence of arrests. True crime enthusiasts, journalists, and online investigators pored over every publicly available document, aerial photograph, and police statement, searching for connections that might have been overlooked. Some fixated on the idea that there might be more than one killer. The differences in victim profiles, disposal methods, and time frames were interpreted as signs that multiple predators could have used the same remote stretch of coastline for their own purposes. Others held firm to the belief that a single individual, methodical and adaptable, was responsible for all the murders. Law enforcement was careful in its public statements. While they acknowledged the possibility of multiple offenders, they continued to treat the majority of the cases as potentially connected. Behind the scenes, investigators cycled through persons of interest. Some were local residents, others were men with prior arrests for violence against women. Each was examined, interrogated, and eventually eliminated when evidence failed to support charges. The anonymity of the killer, or killers, persisted, reinforced by the very environment that had concealed the crimes for so long. As the years stretched into a decade, the case acquired a kind of cold permanence in the public imagination. It was not forgotten, but it had settled into the background of Long Island life, a dark undercurrent beneath the ordinary rhythms of beach tourism, fishing, and suburban commutes. Seasonal visitors drove along Ocean Parkway without realizing that mere yards away, within the thickets and dunes, bodies had once lain hidden for years. Locals passed the spot with an instinctive avoidance, a silent acknowledgement that something evil had happened there. The victims themselves were not forgotten, though their stories were often overshadowed by the mystery of the killer's identity. Each name, Maureen, Melissa, Megan, Amber, and the others, represented more than an entry in a criminal file. They were daughters, sisters, mothers, and friends. Many had struggled with unstable housing, economic hardship, or addiction. Some had moved frequently between cities, leaving behind few consistent records of their lives. These vulnerabilities had made them easier targets for someone willing to exploit them, and their disappearances were initially met with less urgency than they should have been. In hindsight, the delays in connecting their cases allowed the killer to continue unchecked. Technological advances slowly began to alter the investigative landscape. Improvements in DNA testing, including the emerging field of genetic genealogy, offered new possibilities for identifying both victims and suspects. Cold case units across the country were using these methods to solve decades-old murders, and advocates pressed for the same techniques to be applied to the Gilgo Beach case. The challenge was the condition of the evidence. Years of exposure to the elements had degraded much of it, and the quantity of recoverable DNA was limited. Still, analysts worked with what they had, running profiles through national databases, hoping for even the smallest match. The geography of the murders remained a central focus. Gilgo Beach's isolation was deceptive. It was only a short drive from densely populated areas, yet the barrier island setting meant that traffic in and out could be discreetly monitored by anyone familiar with the area. Seasonal patterns of population also played a role. During the summer, the beach was crowded, but in the off-season, the emptiness was profound. The killer had exploited these rhythms, choosing times and locations where the chance of discovery was minimal. Internally, the task force dealt with its own challenges. Leadership changes, shifting budgets, and tensions between agencies sometimes hindered progress. The case had become a test of institutional endurance, requiring persistence in the face of years without visible results. Detectives retired or transferred, leaving newer investigators to absorb the enormous volume of files, photographs, and physical evidence. Each new lead was weighed against the accumulated weight of a decade's worth of false starts. In 2020, a fresh wave of attention swept over the case when Suffolk County Police released new photographs of evidence, including a black leather belt embossed with the letters WH or HM. This detail, while seemingly minor, was significant because it was believed to have been handled by the killer. The release was intended to provoke public memory, to prompt someone, somewhere, to recognize the object. While it generated discussion, it did not produce the breakthrough investigators had hoped for. Then, in the background of a world distracted by global events, a quieter but more decisive development was taking shape. A restructured investigative team, using updated forensic tools and reanalyzing old data, began to converge on a new person of interest. They examined cell phone records with more sophisticated mapping techniques, comparing them to known movements of the victims. The pattern that emerged was not definitive proof, but it was compelling enough to warrant closer surveillance. The suspect lived on Long Island, not far from the areas where the victims had last been seen or found. He was older now, with a long-established life that concealed any hint of violent history. Outwardly, he blended into the community, a man whose presence raised no suspicion among neighbors. But behind the ordinary facade, investigators suspected a connection to the crimes that had haunted the barrier beaches for more than a decade. It would take months of careful work before they could move from suspicion to action. As they watched and waited, the ocean continued its endless cycle beside Gilgo Beach, erasing footprints in the sand, covering and uncovering fragments of debris along the tide line. The same wind that once carried the scent of decay now moved clean and salt-heavy, indifferent to the human story still unfolding at its edge. By early 2022, the Gilgo Beach investigation had shifted into a phase of quiet precision. The suspect who had drawn the attention of the restructured task force was being monitored carefully, his daily movements mapped, his contacts documented. Years of accumulated data, cell phone pings, location histories, vehicle records, were layered over one another until a pattern began to emerge. The lines converged not only on the remote stretches of Ocean Parkway but also on the times and places where the victims were last known to be alive. The man under scrutiny was Rex Heuermann, a 59-year-old architect who lived in Massapequa Park, a suburban community on Long Island's South Shore. His home was situated on a quiet street, just miles from Gilgo Beach. He was married, a father, and had maintained a long career running his own architectural firm in Manhattan. Outwardly, his life was stable and unremarkable, the kind of life that could camouflage darker impulses from even those closest to him. Investigators began a covert examination of his activities stretching back years. His work in Manhattan placed him in proximity to the locations from which taunting phone calls had been made to one victim's family. His residence placed him within a short drive of the body disposal sites. Historical cell tower records suggested that his phone, or phones linked to him, had traveled along routes connecting these two worlds at critical times. Physical evidence was the next hurdle. Detectives collected discarded items from his garbage, searching for any trace of DNA that could be matched to material recovered from the victims. The work was painstaking, the results uncertain. Degradation over years meant that even a partial profile would be significant. In the lab, analysts compared genetic material from the discarded items to a hair found on one of the burlap wrappings at Gilgo Beach. The results strengthened their case. Parallel to the forensic work, investigators scrutinized his online activity. Records revealed a history of searches for violent pornography, missing persons, and news about the Gilgo Beach murders. The pattern suggested not only a deep awareness of the case but an obsessive interest in the crimes themselves. While not definitive proof, these findings aligned with the psychological profile built years earlier, a man methodical in planning, capable of compartmentalizing his life, and careful enough to remain invisible for over a decade. By mid-2023, the evidence had reached a critical mass. The decision to move on Heuermann was made not in a single moment but as the culmination of months of deliberation. The case had waited years for a break, now the priority was to act before any possibility of escape or destruction of evidence could occur. Surveillance teams positioned themselves to track his movements continuously. Warrants were prepared for his home, office, and vehicles. In July 2023, the operation unfolded. Heuermann was taken into custody outside his Manhattan office without incident. The arrest reverberated instantly through the media, reawakening national interest in a case that had haunted Long Island for more than a decade. The image of the unassuming suburban architect, juxtaposed with the brutality of the crimes he was accused of committing, deepened the public's fascination and horror. The searches that followed were exhaustive. At his home in Massapequa Park, investigators spent days combing through every room, attic, and basement space. They removed boxes of evidence, digital devices, and firearms. Ground-penetrating radar was used in the backyard. Cadaver dogs were brought in to check for traces of decomposition. The property, once an ordinary suburban residence, became the focal point of a massive evidence-gathering effort, its contents catalogued piece by piece. Charges were brought in connection with 3 of the Gilgo Beach victims, Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello, with Heuermann named as the prime suspect in the murder of a 4th, Maureen Brainerd Barnes. Prosecutors cited the forensic evidence, the cell phone data, and the online history as central pillars of their case. The possibility that more victims could be linked to him remained open, and the investigation into other remains found along Ocean Parkway continued in parallel. For the families of the victims, the arrest brought a complicated mix of emotions. There was relief that a suspect had finally been identified and taken off the streets, but also the enduring pain of years spent without answers. The arrest could not restore the lives that had been lost, and the looming trial promised to dredge up the details of their final moments in the most public of settings. As the case moved toward court, the broader significance of the arrest began to take shape. The Gilgo Beach murders had exposed not only the existence of a long-hidden predator but also the vulnerabilities in how missing persons cases, particularly those involving marginalized individuals, were investigated. The lessons drawn from the failures and delays would be studied for years to come, influencing how law enforcement approaches similar cases in the future. Ocean Parkway remains what it has always been, a narrow road running between the Atlantic and the marsh, windswept and open to the sky. The traffic still hums along its length, past the places where, for years, the sand concealed silent graves. The dunes are quiet now, the crime scene tape long since removed, but the shadow of what happened there is not so easily erased. The arrest of Rex Heuermann marked a turning point, but the story of the Long Island serial killer is still unfolding, its final chapters yet to be written. In the months following Rex Heuermann's arrest, the Gilgo Beach case entered a new phase, one defined not by the search for a shadowy predator, but by the slow, deliberate pace of the American criminal justice system. The investigation, while having produced enough evidence for multiple murder charges, was far from over. Detectives continued to examine the possibility that Heuermann's crime stretched beyond the 4 women officially tied to him. Old case files from across Long Island, and even from other states, were reviewed for similarities in victim profiles, disposal methods, and timelines. At the same time, forensic teams revisited evidence from the other unidentified remains found along Ocean Parkway and nearby areas. Advances in genetic genealogy offered hope that these victims could finally be named. For some, the process required building family trees from the faintest traces of DNA. For others, missing persons databases offered potential matches that needed confirmation. Each new identification carried its own emotional weight. For families, it meant closure, but also the confirmation of a loss that had lingered unresolved for years. The legal proceedings against Heuermann moved forward with methodical precision. Prosecutors began constructing a narrative for the courtroom, one that combined physical evidence with digital forensics, cell phone mapping, and behavioral patterns. The defense, in turn, prepared to challenge each element, knowing that the stakes could not be higher. Pre-trial hearings drew media coverage from across the country, as journalists, true crime authors, and documentary crews sought to capture the unfolding drama. The arrest had also reignited debate about the systemic failures that had allowed the killings to continue for so long. Critics pointed to the slow response when the victims first went missing, the lack of urgency often seen in cases involving sex workers, and the fractured communication between different law enforcement agencies. In hindsight, the years of delay had given the killer a significant advantage. While the eventual breakthrough was celebrated, it was tempered by the awareness that it could, and should, have come sooner. In Massapequa Park, Heuermann's home stood as a grim landmark, its exterior largely unchanged but its reputation permanently altered. Neighbors who had once passed the house without a second thought now viewed it through the lens of suspicion and unease. The ordinariness of the property became part of the case's unsettling legacy, a reminder that violent predators can live hidden in plain sight, their outward lives a careful disguise. Gilgo Beach itself changed little in appearance. The ocean still pressed against the shore, the dunes still shifted under the wind, and the reeds still swayed in the marsh. Yet for those who knew its history, the landscape had taken on a different dimension. The same isolation that once drew people seeking quiet or solitude had, for years, shielded acts of unspeakable violence. The sand no longer held its secrets, but the knowledge of what had been buried there lingered in the minds of locals and visitors alike. The broader legacy of the case extends beyond Long Island. It stands as a cautionary tale in modern criminal investigation, a study in how geography, victim vulnerability, and investigative blind spots can intersect to create an environment where a killer can operate undetected. It also underscores the importance of persistence. Even in the face of years without progress, the case was kept alive, files preserved, evidence re-examined, and eventually, technology caught up with the mystery. As the trial approaches, uncertainty remains. Whether Heuermann will be convicted, whether other victims will be conclusively linked to him, and whether the full scope of the Gilgo Beach murders will ever be known are questions still hanging over the case. For the families, each court date is another step in a process that has already consumed years of their lives. For investigators, it is the culmination of one of the most complex and haunting cases in New York's history. In the end, the Gilgo Beach murders are a reminder that the past never truly disappears. It waits, in case files, in unmarked graves, in the memories of those left behind, until someone is willing to uncover it. On a stretch of Long Island coastline, the wind still moves through the reeds, the tide still rises and falls, and the ocean keeps its rhythm. But beneath the sound of the waves, there remains a quieter truth: some stories, once revealed, can never again be buried.